Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the wagon's side panel and refused to cry. Not because she wasn't hurting. Not because the whispers hadn't reached her ears the moment the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard of the Cole Ranch. But because she had made herself a promise the morning she left Cheyenne that she would never again let strangers see her break. She had already broken once. She wasn't going to do it twice. The whispers were loud enough that she could have repeated them word for word if she'd wanted to. She didn't want to. She stepped down from the wagon anyway. Before we go any further into Clara's story, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Clara, because what happens next at the Cole Ranch is something nobody in Red Willow, Wyoming saw coming. The wagon had come to a full stop in the yard of the Cole Ranch at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1884, and by the time Clara Whitmore set both feet on Wyoming ground, she had already been judged dismissed and quietly decided upon by every man standing in that yard. She knew it before she heard a single word. She had learned to read judgment the way a weather-worn farmer reads the sky, not because she wanted to, but because her survival had depended on it for most of her 30 years. The way a man's shoulders dropped when he saw her. The way another man's eyes traveled sideways to find a friend's face. The shared glance that passed between strangers who had never spoken, but had instantly agreed on something without saying a word. She was too heavy, too plain, too much of whatever it was that women like her were always accused of being too much of. She had heard it her whole life. It didn't make it easier. It just made it familiar. What she hadn't expected, what still caught her off guard, even after all the years and all the practice, was the sound of one of the ranch hands saying it out loud. He was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned neck and a crooked hat pushed too far back on his head. He didn't even bother to lower his voice. "Lord have mercy," he said, and he wasn't talking about the weather. The man standing beside him bit down on a grin he didn't quite manage to hide. Another one turned to face the barn like he'd suddenly found something very interesting in that direction. Clara didn't stop walking. She didn't slow down. She kept her chin level and her shoulders back, and she carried the single travel bag she'd brought with her across the packed dirt of the yard, as though she had every right in the world to be exactly where she was. Because she did. She had been sent for. She had come. That was the agreement. The man who had sent for her was standing on the porch. Nathan Cole was taller than she'd expected from the letter leaner too, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for so long it had forgotten how to relax. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes the color of creek water in winter, not cold exactly, but not warm either. Just clear. The kind of clear that didn't give much away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he's ordered from a catalog. Assessing. Practical. Not unkind, but not warm. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said back. He came down the 2 porch steps and stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the dust on his collar and the way his shirt had been pressed at some point earlier that day and had long since given up the effort. "You had a good journey." "Long," she said. "But fine." He nodded once, like that settled something, and reached for her travel bag. She let him take it. Not because she needed him to carry it, but because refusing would have started things on a combative note, and she was tired enough without adding that to the afternoon. He turned and led her toward the house, and she followed, and behind them she heard one of the ranch hands say something low that she didn't catch. What she caught was the quiet laughter that came after it. She kept walking. The inside of the ranch house told her more in 30 seconds than Nathan Cole's letter had told her in 3 pages. The letter had said he needed a capable woman to manage the household. It had said the ranch employed 8 men, and that meals were a significant part of keeping operations running smoothly. It had said the previous housekeeper had left the previous winter, and that things had been difficult since then. What the letter had not said was that the kitchen looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of a disaster, and nobody had gone back for it. The stove was blackened in a way that had nothing to do with normal cooking use. One of the burner grates was broken and had been propped up with what appeared to be a piece of firewood jammed underneath it to keep it level. The shelves that ran along the back wall held a row of mismatched tins, several of which had rusted at the lids. The cast iron skillet hanging on the wall hook was coated in something that had gone so far beyond seasoning it had crossed over into neglect. The long table in the center of the room was scarred with knife marks and ring stains from years of coffee cups. The bench seats on either side were worn smooth. The whole room smelled like old grease and stale air. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. Nathan Cole stood slightly behind her. He said nothing, but she felt him waiting for something for the intake of breath, the visible dismay the question she was supposed to ask about when things had last been cleaned properly. She didn't ask it. She set her hand on the doorframe and looked at the room the way she always looked at a kitchen she'd never been in before. She looked at what was there. She looked at what could be done with what was there. She looked at where the light came in and where the heat would travel, and where the work would flow if you organize things the right way. "I'll need a list of what supplies you have," she said, "and I'll need someone to show me where things are kept." Nathan blinked. "That's it. That's where I start," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eli can show you around. He's the youngest. He'll be in the barn." "Thank you." He set her travel bag just inside the kitchen doorway, then looked at her again with that same assessing look he'd had on the porch. "Supper is usually at 6. The men are expecting to eat." "They will eat," she said. She couldn't be sure, but she thought she saw something shift just slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something like the first edge of uncertainty, the first small crack in a certainty he hadn't known he had. He left without saying anything else. Clara pulled the kitchen door all the way open, let the afternoon air move through the room, and got to work. The boy named Eli Parker found her 20 minutes later on her hands and knees in front of the stove with a rag and a bucket of water she'd heated on the one burner that worked without assistance. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "You're the new missus," he finally said. "Clara," she said without turning around. "Hand me that other rag on the shelf, would you?" There was a pause. Then she heard his boots on the floor, and the rag landed on the floor beside her hand. "Mr. Cole said I'm supposed to show you where things are." "I found most of it," she said. "Tell me about the root cellar." "What about it?" "Is it dry? Does the door seal properly?" He thought about it. "Mostly dry. Door sticks sometimes in wet weather." "Is there smoked meat in it?" "Some. Not a lot. Tommy Two Fingers. He's one of the hands he did some smoking back in May, but the men ate most of it by July." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the interior of the stove firebox. It was sooted badly, but the iron itself looked sound. She could work with it. "What about a vegetable garden?" "There's a patch out back. Nobody's been tending it much." "Since when?" Eli scratched the back of his neck. "Since Mrs. Hargrove left. That was February." 6 months, Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She pulled herself to her feet, rinsed her hands in the bucket, and dried them on the clean side of the rag. She looked at Eli properly for the first time. He was 17 if she was being generous, with an honest face and eyes that watched her with the kind of open curiosity that hadn't been trained into suspicion yet. She liked him immediately. "Walk me to the garden," she said. He walked her to the garden. It was worse than she'd hoped, and better than she'd feared. 6 months of neglect in Wyoming summer meant the weeds had come in hard, but underneath the tangle, she could see tomato plants that had survived on stubbornness alone, a row of onions that had gone slightly wild, some late summer squash that had spread beyond its original boundary, and a patch of dried bean plants that still had beans on them if you looked closely enough. She crouched down and pushed the weeds aside and found a potato hiding in the dirt, fat and perfect, and she held it up. "When did anyone last look at this garden?" she asked. Eli watched her from a couple of feet back with his hands in his pockets. "Long time," he admitted. "The men figured it was done." "The men were wrong," she said simply. She stood up and turned around and looked at the back of the ranch house, and looked at the kitchen window, and the lean-to shed attached to the side, and the woodpile that needed restacking, and the water barrel that had a crack running up one side that had been patched with pine tar. A woman who had grown up smaller might have seen problems. Clara saw inventory. She took the potato with her when she went back inside. The afternoon moved fast. She sorted through every tin on the shelves and found enough dried beans, salt, and flour to work with. She located a supply of lard in the cold room off the back of the kitchen. She found a half-wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth that still had some life in it. She sent Eli to the root cellar for what smoked meat remained, and he came back with a chunk of venison about the size of her forearm. Not much, but enough. The other ranch hands drifted past the kitchen window in ones and twos over the course of the afternoon, and she was aware of being watched without making it obvious that she knew. She heard the low commentary from outside. She couldn't always make out the exact words, but she understood the tone well enough. She had been the subject of that tone before. She cracked the kitchen window further open and let them watch if they wanted to. She had nothing to hide in a kitchen. This was where she had always been herself, most fully and most truly. Let them look. By 5 o'clock, she had a pot of bean and venison stew working on the back of the stove, thick with onion and the wild herbs she'd identified growing near the garden fence. Sage and a few sprigs of something that might have been thyme or its near cousin. She wasn't quite sure yet, but it would do. She had flour working into a dough for cornbread, and she had the oven side of the stove which she'd cleaned and tested and found functional after all heating up steadily. The fat in the iron pan she'd scrubbed back to workable was just beginning to shimmer. She had 4 things going at once, and her hands knew exactly where each one was without her having to think about it. That was the gift her mother had given her. Not recipes exactly. Not techniques, though those had come too. What her mother had given her was the understanding that a kitchen was a living thing. You didn't fight it. You moved with it. You learned its rhythms and its tempers and its little peculiarities, and once you understood those, you could do almost anything inside it. She heard boots on the porch. Then the door opened, and a man she hadn't met yet filled the doorframe. He was older than the others she'd seen somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face like weather-beaten leather, and a gray mustache that he wore with the seriousness of a man who had decided that mustache represented something about his character. He stood there and looked at the kitchen, and then looked at her. "Walter Briggs," he said. It wasn't an introduction so much as a statement of fact. "I'm the foreman." "Clara Cole," she said, because that was her name now, even if it still felt like someone else's name in her mouth. "I'll have supper ready at 6. He looked at the pot on the stove, looked at the cornbread pan, looked at the cleaned shelves and the sorted tins and the bucket she'd used for the stove, and the order that had come out of what had been chaos when she arrived. He looked at all of it for a long time without saying anything. "What happened to the grease fire?" he finally said. "The inside of the stove, I cleaned it." "You cleaned it?" "It's a stove, Mr. Briggs. It needed cleaning." He scratched the underside of his jaw. "Mrs. Hargrove used to say that stove couldn't be cleaned, that it was beyond saving." "Mrs. Hargrove was wrong," Clara said, the same way she'd said the men were wrong about the garden. Not unkindly, just plainly. Walter Briggs looked at her for another moment with an expression she'd seen before, the expression of a man recalculating something he'd already decided. Then he nodded once. 6 o'clock, he said. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. He left. She heard him say something to someone on the porch as the door closed. She didn't try to hear what it was. She turned back to her stove. Supper that night was not a miracle. She needed to be clear about that because the truth mattered more than the story anyone wanted to tell afterward. It was not a miracle. It was good food made with care and with limited resources by a woman who knew what she was doing. The cornbread came out of the oven with a crust on it that cracked when you broke it, and a soft center that stayed warm longer than it had any right to. The stew was rich and deep-flavored from the long afternoon of slow heat, and she'd added the potato she'd found in the garden, diced small, and it had thickened everything to something that coated a spoon properly. She had made biscuits, too, because she'd found enough lard, and she had plenty of flour, and because hungry men who'd been eating badly for 6 months deserved biscuits. She carried the pot to the table herself. She carried the cornbread herself. She set out the biscuits herself. She found tin cups that matched approximately and filled the water pitcher from the well pump in the yard and brought it in and set it on the table. Then she went back to the stove and stayed there because she had learned a long time ago that a cook eating with the people she'd fed changed the dynamic in ways that weren't always comfortable for anyone, and she wanted to read the room before she decided where she stood in it. They came in without ceremony, 8 men smelling of horses and work, and the end of a long hot day filing in and dropping onto the bench seats and reaching for bread before some of them had even sat down properly. Clara watched from the stove. She watched the first man tear off a piece of cornbread and put it in his mouth. She watched his jaw slow down. She watched him reach for another piece. She watched the man next to him lift a spoonful of stew and blow on it, and then taste it, and then not put the spoon down again for what felt like a very long time. She watched them eat. She watched the conversation that had started up at the table when they came in slow down, and then mostly stop, not because anything was wrong, but because the food had their full attention, and their full attention had left the room for other concerns. The young one, the one who'd said the thing she wasn't going to repeat, was sitting near the middle of the bench. She saw him eat a biscuit, and then look at the plate of biscuits, and then take another one, with something that looked a little like embarrassment, as though he'd been caught doing something he hadn't expected to want to do. Good, she thought, not meanly, just honestly. Walter Briggs sat at the end of the table nearest Nathan Cole. Clara watched him eat slowly, the way a man eats when he's actually tasting, instead of just consuming. He reached for a second serving of stew. He broke open a piece of cornbread, and she could see from across the room that it had the right interior yellow and soft, the way good cornbread looks when it hasn't been rushed. Nathan Cole sat at the head of the table. He was harder to read than the others. He ate without the visible enthusiasm some of the younger men showed. But he was on his second biscuit before many of the others, and she noticed he'd eaten all the potato pieces in his bowl, which she took as a good sign, because people who didn't like food tended to push the things they were uncertain about to the side. It was Eli who broke the silence at the table. "This is the best food this ranch has seen in 6 months," he announced. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who has no idea that saying something out loud can change the temperature of a room. Nobody contradicted him. Walter Briggs said without looking up from his bowl, "In longer than that." More silence. Then the man who'd turned toward the barn earlier, a thick-shouldered fellow named, as she'd learn later, Cade Morrison, said, "Where'd you learn to do this?" Clara looked over from the stove. "My mother," she said, "and her mother before her." "Where was that?" Cade asked. "Missouri, then Kansas, then wherever there was work." He nodded slowly with the look of a man updating a file he'd opened and closed too quickly. "You've been cooking professionally." "I've been cooking since I was 6 years old," she said. "Whether that's professional or just necessary depends on who's counting." A few of the men exchanged glances, not the sideways kind from before, a different kind. Nathan Cole looked up from his bowl and met her eyes across the room, and for a moment she couldn't read what was in his expression at all. Then he looked back down. She went back to cleaning the stove. That night, after the men had gone to their bunks, and Nathan Cole had retired to whatever part of the house was his, and wasn't the kitchen, Clara sat at the long scarred table, alone in the lamplight, and ate a bowl of the stew she'd made, and a piece of the cornbread she'd saved back, and she was not ashamed of the tears that came quietly, and didn't last long. She was not crying about the whispers or the looks or the judgment she'd arrived into. She had made her peace with all of that long before the wagon brought her to this yard. She was crying because the food was good, because the kitchen had come back to life under her hands, because for the first time in more miles and more years than she wanted to count, she was sitting in a place that felt like it could become something. Not someone else's something, not a temporary something, but a real and permanent and hers. She wiped her face with her apron and finished her supper and washed her bowl and hung her apron on the hook by the stove door. She stood in the clean kitchen. Her kitchen already after only one afternoon, and she looked at what she'd done, and she thought about what came next. Tomorrow she would go back to the garden and pull weeds for 2 hours before breakfast. Tomorrow she would talk to Walter Briggs about the supply situation for winter. Tomorrow she would ask Nathan Cole directly. Not request ask, because there was a difference, and she intended to establish that difference early, what the household budget allowed for food and preserving supplies. Tomorrow there would be more to do than today had held, and today had held a great deal. But tonight she had cooked a meal that fed 8 hungry men and left them quiet in a way that meant something. She had walked into a ruined kitchen and made it work. She had arrived as someone people had already decided about, and she had not tried to change their minds with words. She had just cooked. Her mother had told her once she was 9, maybe 10. Her small hands still learning the feel of dough, that you can't force anyone to see you the way you deserve to be seen. You can only keep doing the work. You can only keep showing up and being exactly who you are, and doing it with every bit of strength you have. And eventually, her mother had said, eventually the work speaks for itself. Clara had been waiting a long time for that eventually. Standing in the lamplight of the Cole Ranch kitchen in Red Willow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1884, she thought she might have found the place where it would finally happen. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She did not dream. She had too much to do tomorrow. Morning came fast and hard, the way mornings did on a working ranch, with the sound of the yard coming alive before full light had settled over the hills. Horses moving in the corral. A door swinging on a hinge that needed oiling. The distant sound of someone at the pump. Clara was already at the stove. She had the fire built up, and the coffee going, real coffee found at the back of a shelf behind a tin of something that had gone bad and been pushed aside, and she had the skillet heating and the last of the smoked venison sliced thin, and a pan of the morning biscuits she'd prepped the night before, going into the oven before the first ranch hand had even made it to the pump. Eli was the first one through the kitchen door. He stopped when he smelled the coffee. "Is that real coffee?" he said. "Find yourself a cup," she told him. He found a cup. She poured. He drank it standing up by the window with both hands around the tin cup, like a man trying to warm himself from the inside out. And then he looked at her over the rim with an expression that was very close to reverent. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara." He tried it out. "How early did you get up?" "Early enough." "Did you sleep?" "Enough to get up early enough?" she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, young and unguarded, and it made the kitchen feel bigger than it was. She was glad for it. The other men came in by ones and twos over the next half hour, and each time the door opened, she heard the pause, that small hesitation of a man who has just smelled something good and is trying to decide if he's imagining it. She heard it over and over. She found it quietly satisfying each time. Breakfast was simple. She hadn't had time or resources for anything elaborate, but the biscuits were right light inside, brown on top, the kind that pull apart in layers, and the venison was crisped in the skillet, with a little of the lard, and some of the wild herbs she'd brought in from outside, and the coffee was strong and real, and she kept it coming, and that was enough. It was, she had found, almost always enough. People who had been eating badly didn't need elaborate, they needed competent and consistent, and made with care. The elaboration could come later, when she'd had time to build a proper pantry and learn the specific hungers of the 8 men she was feeding. For now, biscuits and coffee and hot food served on time. Walter Briggs came in last, which she was beginning to understand was his habit. He did a full yard check in the morning, before he ate, a foreman's habit, and he sat down at his place at the end of the table and looked at the plate she'd set there, and looked at the coffee already poured in his cup, and looked up at her. "You were up before the birds," he said. "The birds weren't going to make breakfast," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. He ate. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He ate a 3rd biscuit. He said nothing else until he pushed back from the table, and then he said to no one in particular, "I'll be riding north fence today. Somebody fix that hinge on the tack room door." He was already out before anyone answered him. Nathan Cole came in after most of the men had gone out to their morning work, which she was also beginning to understand was his pattern. He ate later alone, or nearly so, because the ranch owner's morning started differently than the hands. He poured his own coffee, without asking, which she noted as a good sign. A man who will pour his own coffee in his own house is a man who isn't expecting to be waited on. That made things simpler. He sat down, and she put the plate in front of him. Biscuits, the last of the crisped venison, a small bowl of the leftover bean mixture from the night before, that she'd heated through with a little extra salt, and it ate more like a side than a stew in the morning, and he looked at it and picked up his fork. "You were up early," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "I have a lot to do," she said. "I need to talk to you about supplies." He looked up from this plate. She had his attention in the way she intended, direct, practical, the language he seemed to understand most fluently. "Talk," he said. She pulled out the list she'd made the night before. She hadn't had paper, so she'd used the back of a flour tin label she'd peeled clean. She smoothed it on the table. "I need salt," she said. "A substantial amount. Enough for preserving through winter. I need more lard. I need sugar. I need a new sack of dried beans and lentils if they can be sourced, and I need vinegar for pickling. The garden out back has vegetables that can be saved if I start on them this week, but I need the preserving supplies to do it." Nathan Cole looked at the list. He looked at her. "That's a significant order," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But I can tell you what it will cost you if you don't place it. You'll pay for food all winter at town prices, and in a bad winter that goes up. I can put up enough from that garden and the right dry goods to feed 8 men through a Wyoming January without buying more than basics once the ground freezes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the flour tin label list again. "You know how to put food up for winter, Mr. Cole," she said, and she kept her voice level and her hands still on the table. "I have been feeding people through hard winters since I was old enough to stand at a stove. I know how to put food up for winter. I know how to stretch a cellar through March. And I know that the kitchen you showed me yesterday was one supply shortage away from your men eating boiled grain by Christmas." He held her gaze. She held his back. It was the first real test. Not the food which had spoken for itself. This the direct conversation, the asking for what she needed without apology. This was the first test of what kind of arrangement this was going to be. He said, "I'll have the supply order sent to town by end of week." "End of week may be too late for the squash," she said. "I need to start the pickling by Wednesday at the outside." Another moment of silence. Then, "I'll ride to town tomorrow." "Thank you," she said. She took the flour tin label off the table and went back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him eat. She heard the sound of his fork on the tin plate. The particular quiet of a man eating alone in a kitchen that smelled like biscuits and coffee, and something that was starting slowly and improbably to resemble a home. She didn't turn around, but she was aware of him in the way she was always aware of the room she was in, its temperature, its sounds, its particular quality of light. And she thought that Nathan Cole, who had not known what to do with his own kitchen for 6 months and had ordered a wife the way you order a piece of needed equipment, was sitting at his table in the morning eating food someone had made for him with care, and that he didn't know yet what that was going to do to him over time. She did. She'd seen it before. Good food made by patient hands was one of the oldest forces in the world, and it always worked eventually. It wasn't magic. It wasn't romance. It wasn't some grand gesture or dramatic declaration. It was just showing up, every morning, and doing the work. She wiped down the stovetop while his coffee was still warm, and she was already thinking about the garden. The weeds were not going to pull themselves. The squash was not going to wait. And Clara Whitmore. Clara. Cole, she reminded herself. Clara Cole had never in her life been a woman who waited for something to happen to her. She made things happen. That was the only way she'd ever known how to live. And it was, she understood now, looking at this cold and neglected and quietly desperate ranch that had been handed to her as a challenge, dressed up as a marriage, exactly what she was going to do here. She was going to make something happen. She just needed time, and she intended to use every minute of it. The first week passed in a blur of work that started before sunrise and rarely ended before the lamp had burned down low. Clara pulled weeds in the garden until her back made its feelings known, and then kept going because the squash wouldn't wait. She restructured the shelves in the kitchen so that the things used every day were at reaching height, and the things used weekly were above, and the things kept for special use or emergency were below. She found a broken window latch on the cold room door that had been letting warm air in, and she fixed it with a piece of wire she found in the tool lean-to, which wasn't a proper fix, but was a functional one that would hold until she could ask for the right part. She cooked 3 meals a day every day without variance. That was the foundation. Everything else could change: recipes, supplies, methods, but the 3 meals were fixed. They would be on time, they would be sufficient, and they would be made with care. Within 3 days, the ranch hands had stopped talking during mealtimes the way men talk when they're eating something they need to get through. They started eating slowly. They started eating past the point of strict necessity, staying at the table with coffee cups that she kept refilled, not because they had nowhere to be, but because they were comfortable. She noticed, but she didn't comment. Comfort was the goal. It didn't need to be named. The young one, she'd learned his name, was Billy Walsh. The one with the sunburned neck came through the kitchen on the 3rd morning with his hat in his hands and stopped in the doorway. "Ma'am," he said. She was making a pastry she'd been planning since she identified a jar of dried apples on the top shelf. "Billy," she said without turning around. A pause. "You know my name?" "I know all your names," she said. "Eli told me the first day." He was quiet. She kept working the pastry. Then he said in a voice that was trying very hard not to sound as young as it was, "I said something when you got here, when you stepped down from the wagon." She turned around then. She looked at him properly, the way she'd look at anyone who was taking the trouble to say something that cost them something. He was red, not just the sunburn, really red. "I know what you said," she told him. "I shouldn't have said it." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. He was very young. He had the face of someone who had been told somewhere along the way that being unkind was a way of belonging to a group of men, and who had not yet figured out that it wasn't. "Don't apologize to me with words," she said. "Apologize with how you act from here forward. I don't need the words. I need to know it won't happen again." He looked at her. "It won't, ma'am. I swear it." "Good," she said. "Now go eat your breakfast before the biscuits go cold." He went. She turned back to the pastry. She had told him the truth. She didn't need words. Words were easy and cost nothing. What a person did with their hands and their time and their daily choices, that was the measure of things. She had been measured by words her whole life. She measured other people differently. By the end of the first week, Nathan Cole had made the supply run to town and come back with most of what was on her list, and 1 or 2 things she hadn't asked for, but that suggested he'd thought about it beyond just copying down what she'd written. He'd brought back a good quantity of salt and vinegar, and a tin of pepper that she hadn't listed, and a small paper package of something that turned out to be dried mint. She held the mint up and looked at it. "Tea," he said from the doorway. He looked slightly uncomfortable, in the way of a man who has done something spontaneous and is not sure it was the right call. "Thought you might, it's the sort of thing." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, as though that was the end of the conversation, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway while she organized the new supplies onto the shelves, and she was aware of him the same way she'd been aware of him all week. That quality of attention he paid to the kitchen when she was in it, as though he was trying to understand something about the room that kept changing every time he came back to it. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. She looked up from the shelf. "What did you expect?" He seemed to think about it honestly, which she respected. He could have deflected. He chose not to. "Someone who would need more—" He stopped. "Managing," he said carefully. "I see," she said. I don't mean that as an insult. I know you don't, she said. You expected someone who would need to be led. I'm not that. Is that going to be a problem? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I don't think it is. Good, she said. She turned back to the shelf. I'm going to start pickling tomorrow morning. I'll need the use of the yard fire pit in the afternoon for the canning jars. Done, he said. She heard him leave. She went on organizing the shelves, and she let herself just for a moment be something close to satisfied. Not because he'd approved of her, she didn't need approval, but because the arrangement was clarifying. Because the shape of this life was beginning to emerge from what had been formless, and the shape of it, the work and the cooking and the garden, and the management of a household that was slowly, day by day, becoming what a household was supposed to be, was one that fit the particular dimensions of who she was. She had spent 30 years being too much of one thing and not enough of another. Here in this kitchen, in this ranch, she was exactly enough. She intended to stay that way. Outside the window, the Wyoming hills rolled on toward the horizon, and the late summer light lay gold across the yard. And somewhere in the corral, a horse was making a complaint about something. And Clara Cole pressed her hands flat against the shelf she'd just organized, and breathed in the smell of her kitchen sage and coffee, and clean iron, and the faint sweetness of dried apple on the air. And she thought, this is where it starts. This is where the eventually begins. The pickling started on Wednesday the way Clara had said it would. She was out at the yard fire pit before the sun had fully cleared the hills with the canning jars she'd found in the cold room. Storage dusty, mismatched. Several of them missing their rubber rings, lined up on the old plank board she'd set across two sawhorses to use as a work surface. She'd spent part of the previous evening tracking down replacement rings and had found exactly enough in a tin box at the back of the cold room shelf, which she took as a small sign that the ranch itself was on her side, even if the men weren't all the way there yet. Eli showed up without being asked and started hauling water from the pump. You don't have to do that, she told him. I know, he said, and kept hauling. She let him. The boy had a good instinct for where the work was, and more importantly, he did the work without needing to be told what it meant or what it was for. That was rarer than most people understood. By mid-morning, the fire was going steady, and the first batch of jars was processing, and the yard smelled like vinegar and dill and the particular sharpness of pickling brine that Clara had loved since she was a girl. Her mother had called it the smell of winter being handled. You put up enough jars in the fall, her mother said, and winter loses its teeth. Walter Briggs walked past twice without stopping. The second time he slowed down enough that she knew he wanted to say something. She kept her attention on the fire and let him come to it on his own terms. You know what you're doing with that brine, he finally said. She looked up. I've put up more jars than I can count, Mr. Briggs. Yes. Last woman tried to do canning out here, blew a jar, he said. Sealed it wrong. It went off in February, and the smell about drove the men out of the cold room entirely. I sealed them correctly, she said. You can check them in February. He looked at the line of jars already sealed and cooling on the board. He looked at the fire at the processing pot, at the organized system she'd built out of the available equipment. You're going to need more jars than that if you're planning to put up the whole garden, he said. She looked at him steadily. I know. Are there more somewhere, or do I need to add them to the supply list? He was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a crate of them in the tack room, left over from 3 years back. Nobody thought to look. Could someone bring them to me? He was already walking toward the tack room. She watched him go, and then turned back to the fire, and she allowed herself the small private satisfaction of that of a man like Walter Briggs, who had been foreman on this ranch longer than some of the hands had been alive, going to find canning jars for a woman he'd been skeptical of 5 days ago. Not because she'd demanded it, because she'd earned it. The crate appeared within the hour, carried by 2 of the younger hands who set it down near the sawhorses and stood there for a moment, looking at the operation she'd set up. One of them, a quiet man named Roy, who she'd observed mostly kept to himself, looked at the sealed jars and said, How many you figure to put up? As many as the garden will give me, she said. And then whatever I can source before the first freeze. Roy looked at the garden. There's a farm about 4 miles east, he said. Old Hendricks. He's got more squash than he can use most years. He'd probably trade. She looked at Roy. He was looking at the garden, not at her in the way of a man who has information that might be useful, but isn't entirely sure it's his place to offer it. What would he want in trade? She asked. His wife died 2 springs ago, Roy said. He's been eating his own bad cooking ever since. I reckon a jar or 2 of something good would go a long way. Clara looked at the processing pot. She looked at the garden. She did the arithmetic of it in her head and made a decision. Tell him I'll send 2 jars of preserves and a fresh-baked pie on Friday, she said, and ask him how much squash he can spare. Roy looked at her then properly, for the first time since she'd arrived. He had steady eyes and a face that had been weathered into something that didn't give much away, but what she saw in it right then was the beginning of respect. Not the finished thing, but the beginning of it. Yes, ma'am, he said. He walked away without another word, and she turned back to the fire, and that was how Clara Cole began building something that nobody on the Cole Ranch had thought to build in years. A network. Not a large one. Not a formal one. Just the careful, practical web of exchange and goodwill that a woman who understands how communities work builds quietly and without announcement, trade by trade, jar by jar, until one day people realize they are part of something and cannot remember exactly when it began. Nathan Cole noticed the Friday pie before she'd even told him about the Hendricks arrangement. He came into the kitchen Friday morning and found her crimping the edge of a crust with the focused attention she gave to anything she was doing properly, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "That's not for the men." "It's for old Hendricks," she said. "Roy tells me he's been eating badly since his wife passed. We're trading for squash." Nathan was quiet for a beat. "You've been talking to Roy. He had useful information about local resources. I used it." Another pause. "Hendricks is particular," Nathan said slowly. "He doesn't take well to he's been independent since Margaret died. Doesn't like to feel like he's being managed." "I'm not managing him," Clara said. "I'm trading with him. There's a difference." "How much squash are you expecting?" "Roy is finding out today." Nathan looked at the pie. He looked at her. She could see him working through something, not skepticism, exactly more like a man recalculating the dimensions of a space he thought he already knew. "All right," he said. "There's also a widow north of town that Roy mentioned," she said without looking up from the crust. "Mrs. Danforth. She's been selling eggs but not getting fair price at the general store. I'd like to talk to you about establishing a direct arrangement with her." "You've been busy," Nathan said, and his voice had something new in it, something that recognized for the first time that the woman he'd ordered to run his kitchen had a different understanding of what running a kitchen meant than he'd carried into that arrangement. "I'm always busy," she said. "That's not going to change." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Talk to Mrs. Danforth." He poured his coffee and left, and Clara pressed the final crimp into the pie crust and slid it into the oven, and she thought, good. That's how it was going to go. Not all at once. Not in any grand moment of recognition. Just this small concessions of territory earned one practical conversation at a time, until the space she occupied in this ranch was large enough to do what needed doing. She could work with that. What she hadn't expected, what blindsided her on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, was the arrival of a woman from town. Her name was Mrs. Gertrude Aldous, and she arrived in a buggy driven by her husband, who sat on the seat with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that certain errands are best conducted in silence. Mrs. Aldous herself was a tall woman somewhere in her 60s, with a spine like a fence post, and a hat she wore with the authority of a judge wearing a gavel. Clara heard the buggy in the yard and came to the kitchen door, and the moment she saw Mrs. Aldous looking at the ranch house with the expression of someone conducting an inspection, she understood exactly what kind of call this was. She wiped her hands on her apron and went out. "Mrs. Cole," said Mrs. Aldous without preamble. "I am Gertrude Aldous. My husband is a member of the Red Willow Town Council. I've come to call." "Mrs. Aldous," Clara said, "would you like to come inside?" What followed was the particular kind of social combat that women of a certain position conducted through politeness. Mrs. Aldous sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea, the dried mint Nathan had brought back from town, steeped properly, and looked around the kitchen with eyes that were cataloging everything. "You've been busy," Mrs. Aldous said in a tone that suggested she hadn't yet decided if that was good. "There was a great deal to do," Clara said. "So I've heard." Mrs. Aldous set down her cup. "The town has been talking about Nathan Cole's new wife." Clara met her eyes. "I imagine so. They're saying the ranch hands are refusing to eat in town anymore." "I wouldn't know what the ranch hands do in town," Clara said evenly. "I only know what they do here." Mrs. Aldous studied her for a long moment. Then she said in a slightly different tone, the tone of a woman who has been testing something and is now adjusting based on what she found. "Where did you come from, Mrs. Cole?" "Missouri originally, then Kansas." "Family?" "My mother and I. She passed 4 years ago." Something shifted in Mrs. Aldous's expression, not softening exactly, but recognition. The particular look of a woman who has also survived the loss of someone necessary. "You have no other family," she said. "I have this ranch," Clara said simply. Another long pause. Mrs. Aldous looked at the shelves properly organized now, and stocked from the supply run and the Hendricks squash and the Danforth eggs. She looked at the preserves lined up in the cold room doorway. She looked at the kitchen that had been a disaster 3 weeks ago and was now undeniably a functioning home. "I run the Red Willow Ladies' Aid Society," Mrs. Aldous said. "We meet on the second Tuesday of the month. I would like you to come." Clara looked at her. She understood what was being offered. Not friendship, not yet. But inclusion. The formal recognition of the community's gatekeeper that Clara Cole was a person who belonged to this place, that she was not temporary, that she was not a joke. "I'll be there," Clara said. Mrs. Aldous stood, straightened her hat, and walked to the door. There she stopped and turned back, and for the first time her expression carried something that was genuinely not performance. "This tea is very good," she said. "Dried mint," Clara said. "My husband brought it from town." Something moved across Mrs. Aldous's face. "Did he?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. She left. Clara stood in the doorway and watched the buggy roll back toward town, and she thought about what had just happened and what it meant, and she thought, there it is, the door that opens the other doors. She went back to the stove. Nathan heard about the visit that evening. Walter Briggs told him because Walter Briggs had seen the buggy and had his own understanding of what a visit from Gertrude Aldous meant in terms of a person's standing in Red Willow. Nathan came to the kitchen door after supper when the men had gone out and Clara was finishing the cleaning. "Gertrude Aldous came today," he said. "She did." "And she invited you to the Ladies' Aid." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "Gertrude Aldous has not invited anyone to that society in 4 years. The last woman she invited was the new schoolteacher, and she only did that because the woman threatened to leave town otherwise." Clara folded the dishcloth over the oven handle. "I didn't threaten anyone." "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at her with that assessing look she'd come to understand as his version of genuine attention. "You made her tea." "I made her tea," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She didn't make anything of it in her expression, but she registered it. "Yes, the arrangement I proposed, when I wrote the letter, I want you to know that I understand now that it wasn't a fair description of what I was asking for." She waited. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned that Nathan Cole said the important things slowly working toward them, the way you work toward difficult ground, and that interrupting the approach didn't serve either of them. "I said I needed someone to manage the household," he said. "I didn't understand when I wrote that how much I didn't understand about what that meant. What you're doing here it's more than that." "I know," she said. He looked at her with something in his expression trying to find its way to something it wasn't sure it knew the name for yet. "I want to make sure you have what you need," he said. "Whatever you need, you tell me." This was the moment she'd been waiting for. "I need a smokehouse," she said. He blinked. "A smokehouse? A proper one, a real smokehouse that can handle a full winter's worth of meat. If I have that, I can put up enough smoked venison and pork to carry this ranch through the hardest winter Wyoming has to offer without buying from the butcher in town at winter prices." He stared at her. "Do you know what a smokehouse costs to build? Less than buying from the butcher all winter," she said. "I've done the arithmetic. Would you like me to show you?" He stared at her for another long moment. Then slowly something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. Something warmer than any expression he'd shown yet. Something that carried a quality she could only describe as genuinely surprised, the way a man looks when he has discovered that a thing he thought was one size is actually considerably larger. "Yes," he said. "Show me." She showed him. Right there at the kitchen table, with the lamp turned up and a piece of paper she'd saved from the supply wrapping, she showed him the numbers she'd worked out over the past week. The current cost of winter meat, purchases, the estimated cost of smokehouse construction using materials available locally, the projected savings across 1 winter and across 5 winters and across 10. He read the numbers twice. He looked up. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. And it wasn't the same question the hands had asked about her cooking. It was something more fundamental than that. "Same place I learned everything else," she said. "From watching what needed to be done and figuring out how to do it." He looked at the numbers a third time. "I'll talk to the carpenter in town next week," he said. She nodded. She began gathering up the paper to put away. "Clara," he said again. She looked up. "I was wrong about what I thought I was asking for," he said. "I want you to know that I know that." She held his gaze. "The ranch has been half managed for a long time, Nathan. It just needed someone to pay attention to it." He went still. She had called him Nathan. Neither of them made anything of it. But neither of them forgot it either. He left. She stayed. And she stood in her kitchen in the lamplight, and she thought the shape of this life was beginning to emerge from what had been formless, and the shape of it was one that fit who she was. She had spent 30 years being too much of one thing and not enough of another. Here she was, exactly enough. What shifted everything permanently, what took all she'd built and put it under a pressure that could have broken it, came from town. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Pratt. She heard his name for the first time from Eli, who came into the kitchen on a Monday morning with the particular stiffness of someone carrying bad news he wasn't sure was his to deliver. "There's talk in town," Eli said. Clara kept working the biscuit dough. "Talk about what?" "About the ranch. About you." She looked up. What was on his face was worry. "Tell me," she said. "Gerald Pratt. He owns the Mercantile on Main Street. He's been telling people that you've been cutting into his business, that you've been making arrangements with Hendricks and Mrs. Danforth and going around the town supply system." Eli turned his hat in his hands. "He said you came here because nobody else would have you, that you're the kind of woman who has to buy herself a situation because she can't earn one." The kitchen went very quiet. Clara set down the dough. She stood at the work table with her floury hands still, and she let what Eli had just said settle into the room without reacting to it. "What else?" she said. Eli looked like it cost him something. "Walter heard it. He was in the hardware store for nails. He heard all of it." She looked at Eli for a long moment. Then she picked up the dough and went back to work. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Aren't you?" Eli started. "I heard you," she said. "Go get your breakfast." She had known something like this was coming. There was always something like it. She had spent 30 years as a woman who took up too much space in rooms that hadn't been built with her in mind, and she had learned that the people who resented that most were never the people who knew her. They were always the people who saw what she was building and decided it was a threat before they'd spent 5 minutes in the same room with her. Gerald Pratt had never been in the same room with her. He was already threatened. which meant she was already winning even if it didn't feel like it. Walter Briggs came to the kitchen at midday, not his usual time, and he knocked on the doorframe, which he had never done before. "I heard what Pratt said in town," he told her. She was at the stove and she turned around. "Eli told me," she said. "Eli shouldn't have had to. I should have come to you directly this morning." She looked at him. He was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hand, and his expression was carrying something she hadn't seen it carry before. "What Pratt said," Walter began, "about you coming here because nobody else would have you. About not being able to earn a situation." He met her eyes. "It was a lie. Every word of it. And I should have said so louder than I did when I heard it." "What did you say?" she asked carefully. "I told him he didn't know what he was talking about. I said I'd eaten well for 3 weeks, and that was more than I could say for the 3 years before." "That's something," she said. "It's not enough," he said. "And I know it's not enough." He turned his hat in his hands. "The things I thought when you stepped off that wagon. I'm not proud of those things." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "The people who judged me when I arrived were doing what people do when they don't have enough information. What Pratt is doing now is different. He has enough information. He just doesn't like what it tells him." Walter looked at her. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to make lunch," she said. "And then I'm going to finish the preserving. And on Tuesday, I'm going to the Ladies' Aid Society meeting because Gertrude Aldous invited me, and I said I would be there." "And Pratt." "Gerald Pratt sells dry goods," Clara said. "I manage this ranch's kitchen and supply chain, and I have relationships with every local producer within 5 miles who is willing to trade fairly. He can say what he wants. What matters is what's true." She turned back to the stove. Behind her, Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice rougher than she'd ever heard from him, "My wife used to cook like you do. Not the same things, but the same way. She passed 12 years ago. Fever. Quick." He stopped. "This kitchen has been a hard place to be for a long time. Since before Hargrove left. It was a hard place already." Clara kept her eyes on the stove. She understood he needed to say this without being looked at. "This is the first time in a long time this room has felt like—" He stopped again. "A kitchen," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "A kitchen." She kept her eyes forward. "Your wife taught you something about what a kitchen is supposed to be," she said. "I'm sorry she's not here." He cleared his throat. "You're going to be all right here, Mrs. Cole. Whatever Pratt says, you're going to be all right." He left before she could answer. She stood at the stove with her pot, and she let the words land where they needed to land, and she did not cry, but it was closer than it had been the night she'd cried over her own good cooking. Because this was different. The cooking was hers. She'd always known its value. But a man like Walter Briggs saying you're going to be all right, that was something she hadn't let herself want, because wanting it had always cost her too much before. She wiped her hands on her apron. She made lunch. Roy brought her the news that changed the shape of everything 4 days later. He came to the kitchen door on a Friday afternoon with the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy since morning and has finally decided to set it down. He sat at the table when she offered. He put his hat on the table and looked at it. "Gerald Pratt has been going to neighboring ranch owners directly," he said. "Not just talking in town, visiting them. Telling them that Nathan made a bad choice, that you're spending money on projects that don't serve a cattle operation." Roy looked up. "He mentioned the smokehouse by name to Mitchell Crawford, who owns the Double C north of here. Crawford told Tommy Two Fingers at the waterhole yesterday. Tommy told me this morning." Clara was very still. "Did Crawford seem persuaded?" she asked. "Uncertain," Roy said carefully. "He and Nathan have old history. If Pratt's been working him, Crawford controls the north water access that Nathan's cattle use part of the year." There it was. This was not about her cooking anymore. This was about the ranch's survival. In a larger sense, the business relationships and land use agreements and the fragile network of goodwill that a cattle operation depended on and someone was methodically working to cut through it. Someone who had decided that Clara Cole was the weak point. "Does Nathan know about Crawford?" she asked. "I came to you first," Roy said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Pratt's targeting you specifically," he said. "And because in 4 weeks, I've watched you handle every problem this ranch threw at you by knowing exactly what to do and doing it without making noise about it. So I figured you'd want to know, and I figured you'd know what to do with it." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Thank you, Roy." He stood. "One more thing. The Hendricks trade. 4 more ranches east of here have asked Hendricks about it. Word travels out here." He paused. "It's traveling in your favor. Whatever Pratt's saying, the word from people who work land and need to eat through winter is traveling in your favor." He left. Clara sat alone in the kitchen and thought. She thought about Pratt and Crawford and Northwater Access and cattle season, and she thought about all the things that had to keep working for Nathan Cole to keep this land. She thought about what a woman in her position could do about any of it. Not much on paper, but on paper had never been where Clara operated. She opened the account ledger she'd been keeping since the 2nd week. She found a clean page. She picked up the pen. She had an idea. She was still writing when Nathan came in, and he stopped when he saw her at the table with the ledger and the particular focused stillness of a person doing something that matters. "Roy talked to me," he said. "Good," she said without looking up. "This is more serious than Pratt making noise in town." "I know." She finished the line she was writing. Then she looked up. "Sit down, Nathan." He sat. She slid the ledger across the table to him. He looked at it, and she watched his face as he read. She watched the furrow between his brows. She watched his eyes move across the numbers. She watched him go still. "What is this?" he said. "It's a proposal," she said. "A winter supply cooperative. 6 ranches in the area pooling preserved food resources, each contributing what their land can provide, each drawing on the collective through winter at cost no markup." He looked up from the ledger. "You want to?" "Crawford's operation has sheep," she said. "He can contribute wool-preserved meat and products that keep well in cold. Hendricks has more root vegetables than any one ranch can use. The Danforth widow has the egg supply. We have the smokehouse and the preserving operation already running." She paused. "A cooperative like this makes every ranch in it stronger through winter. It also makes the relationships between those ranches something that nobody can cut through by poisoning one opinion at a time." Nathan stared at her. "You want to solve the Crawford problem," he said slowly, "by making Crawford a partner." "I want to solve the winter food problem for 6 ranches," she said, "which happens to also solve the Crawford problem, the Pratt problem, and any future problem that comes from this ranch being isolated." Silence. Nathan Cole looked at the ledger for a long time. Then he looked up at his wife. This woman who had walked into his ruined kitchen 4 weeks ago and had not in all that time done a single thing he had anticipated, and he said something that came from a place considerably deeper than management or practicality. "Clara," he said, "who are you?" She looked at him across the table. "I'm the woman you sent for," she said simply. "I just turned out to be more than you expected." He held her gaze. What was in his face now was not assessment. It was not surprise. It was not the careful management of an uncertain situation. It was something that didn't have a practical name. It was the look of a man who has stopped being surprised that he underestimated someone and has started being grateful instead and doesn't quite know what to do with the gratitude yet. "I'll ride to Crawford's tomorrow," he said. "Will you write out a version of this I can show him?" "It's already written," she said. "Second page." He turned to the second page. He read it. He read it again. He looked up one more time, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, and the lamp burned between them, and the Wyoming night settled in around the ranch house, and through the window, the frame of the smokehouse stood dark and solid against the sky. Her smokehouse, her kitchen, her ranch. "I'll be back by supper," he said. He took the ledger. He left. Clara stood alone in the kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of what was building here. Not the romance of it, not the grand shape of it, but the real and daily and practical weight of a life that was becoming hers, in ways she hadn't dared to let herself believe, when the wagon first rolled into this yard. Then she stood up and started on supper. The work didn't stop because things were going well. The work was the whole point. The work was the thing she had built her life around, and it was enough. It had always been enough. It always would be. Nathan rode to Crawford's Double C spread the next morning and came back before noon. Clara heard the horse in the yard and kept her hands in the bread dough she was working and waited. She had learned not to read Nathan Cole's silences too quickly. The man carried things in different ways, depending on what they were, and she needed to see his face before she decided what the return meant. He came through the kitchen door and set his hat on the hook and stood there for a moment without speaking. She looked at him. "Crawford listened," he said. "And he wants a meeting." Nathan pulled out a chair and sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of a man who has ridden hard and thought harder. "He wants to meet the person who wrote the proposal. Not me, you." Clara pressed her knuckles into the dough. "When?" "Saturday. He'll come here. He wants to see the operation." She thought about that. Saturday was 3 days away. The smokehouse frame was up, but Holt the carpenter wasn't finished with the interior yet. The cold room was well stocked, but not at its full capacity. The kitchen was hers now in every way that mattered, but she had been here 5 weeks and there were still things she was building toward. "Fine," she said. Nathan looked at her. "He's not a simple man, Crawford. He's been in this territory since before most of the ranches around here existed. He's seen a lot of schemes and a lot of people who came out here with big ideas and left when things got hard." "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know that," he said. "I want you to know that I know that." She met his eyes. There was something in his expression that had become familiar to her in the past 2 weeks, a quality of attention that was different from the practical assessment of the early days. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have started to depend on, and are only now understanding the depth of that dependence. She turned back to the bread. "Tell me about the old history between you and Crawford," she said. A pause. "That's a longer conversation. I have bread to knead. You have time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Crawford and my father were in business together before I took over the ranch. There was a dispute about a boundary line. My father handled it badly. Crawford handled it worse. By the time it was done, 2 years of range friendship was gone. And we've been careful neighbors ever since. Polite, but careful." Whose fault was the boundary dispute? Another pause. Longer this time. "Probably equal," he said finally. "But my father never admitted his share of it, and Crawford never forgot that. And you?" "I inherited the situation." "Nathan!" She kept working the dough. "Did you ever go to Crawford directly and tell him you understood your father handled it badly?" Silence. "No," he said. "That might be worth doing on Saturday," she said, "before we talk business." She could feel him looking at the back of her head. "You think an apology for something that happened before I took over the ranch is going to change 15 years of careful neighborliness," he said. "I think it cost you nothing and might change everything," she said. "And I think the fact that you haven't done it already is probably more about pride than calculation." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Nathan Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest thing to one she'd heard from him. "You don't pull your punches," he said. "I don't see the point," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, in a different tone entirely, "My father would have hated you." She glanced back at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, but there was something on his face that was almost the beginning of a smile. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "It was meant as one," he said. She went back to the bread. It was the closest thing to warmth they'd had between them yet, and it sat in the kitchen with them both unacknowledged and present, like something that had always been there waiting to be noticed. Crawford arrived on Saturday at 10 in the morning. He came alone, which Clara took as a good sign. A man who brings an audience to a first meeting is making a statement. A man who comes alone is genuinely curious. He was in his late 50s with the build of a man who had been physically large in his youth and had settled into something more durable with age. He had a white beard trimmed close and eyes that were the particular sharp pale blue of a man who had spent decades reading weather and terrain and people with equal attention. He shook Nathan's hand in the yard, and Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, and she saw the moment Nathan said something that made Crawford's expression shift not dramatically, but perceptibly the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves. She didn't hear what Nathan said. She didn't need to. He'd taken her advice. Crawford came inside, and Clara offered coffee, which he accepted, and she put the cups on the table and sat down across from him. And he looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he hasn't fully formed an opinion about yet. "You wrote the cooperative proposal," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. "Nathan's been here 17 years. He never thought of it." "Nathan's been running a cattle operation," she said. "I'm running a household. We see different things." Crawford looked at her steadily. "What made you think I'd be interested?" "You have more sheep than you can market locally," she said. "Your preserved meat operation is limited by your ability to distribute and by the overhead of running it solo. A cooperative gives you distribution without overhead and a consistent trade network that doesn't depend on town pricing." Crawford turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You've been asking around about my operation." "I've been learning about my neighbors," she said, "the way any person should who intends to stay somewhere." "Intend to stay," he said. "Pratt says different." "What does Pratt say?" she asked, though she already knew. "Says you're temporary. Says Nathan made a desperation choice and you'll be gone before spring." Clara looked at him evenly. "Mr. Crawford, I have put up 43 jars of preserves. I have a smokehouse going up in my yard. I have trade relationships with 4 local producers. I have attended the Red Willow Ladies' Aid Society at Gertrude Aldis's personal invitation." She paused. "Do those sound like the actions of a woman who intends to leave before spring?" Crawford said nothing for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the cold room doorway where the preserves were visible in their rows. He looked at her. "No," he said. "They don't. Gerald Pratt's opinion of my permanence is not something I spend much energy on," she said. "What I spend energy on is this ranch and the community around it. You are part of that community. I would like us to be useful to each other." Crawford was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was very still. Then he said, "Show me the smokehouse." She showed him. He walked around the frame with the carpenter's half-finished interior, and he asked technical questions about the airflow design, about the wood she intended to use for smoking, about the capacity she was planning, and she answered all of them. And when she didn't know something precisely, she said so, and when she did know, she was specific. He stopped in front of the frame and looked at it for a long moment. "My wife used to run a smoking operation on our spread," he said, "before she got sick. Best smoked venison in the territory." He paused. "Nobody's done it right since." Clara said nothing. She let the statement stand. Crawford turned and looked at her. "The cooperative," he said. "I want a written agreement, clear terms, equal contribution and equal draw." "I have a draft," she said. "I can have a final version ready by Monday." He looked at her one more time with those sharp, pale eyes. "Nathan married smarter than he knew," he said. She didn't smile. "Nathan married someone who needed a home," she said. "Whether that was smart or lucky depends on your perspective." Crawford almost smiled. "Both, maybe," he said. He stayed for lunch. She had planned for the possibility, which was why the chicken bought from Mrs. Danforth that Thursday, the first live chickens the ranch had seen in years, was already roasting, and why there was a second pie cooling on the shelf. She fed Crawford the best lunch she'd put on the table since she arrived, and she watched him eat it with the satisfaction of a woman who has understood from the beginning that food is not just nourishment. It is argument. It is evidence. It is the most honest thing one person can offer another. Crawford ate 2 pieces of pie. When he left, he shook Nathan's hand in the yard, and then he turned to Clara and tipped his hat. It was a small gesture, a frontier courtesy, the kind men extended to women of standing. She had not been on the receiving end of that gesture from a man like Mitchell Crawford before. She nodded in return, and she kept her face composed, and she went back into the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment, with her back to the door, and breathed. Nathan came in behind her. "He's in," he said. "I know," she said. "How did you know he'd come around?" "Because he came alone," she said. "And because he asked technical questions about the smokehouse. Men who have already decided don't ask technical questions." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Clara. You should know something." He paused. "Pratt is not going to stop." She turned around. "I know that too. He's been to see the bank in Laramie." Nathan's voice was careful, measured, but underneath the measurement there was something tight. "Pratt has been suggesting to the bank that this ranch is a poor credit risk, that the new management is making spending decisions that don't reflect sound cattle operation principles." Clara was very still. "The smokehouse," she said. "Shidapomite, among other things. The supply trades. The cooperative proposal." He met her gaze. "Pratt is trying to make the case to the bank that I've let a woman with no frontier experience make decisions that are going to cost this ranch." The kitchen was completely quiet. Clara thought about what a bank in Laramie knew and what it didn't know, and what it would take to show them the difference. "Does the bank have a representative who comes to the territory?" she asked. "Quarterly," Nathan said. "His name is Alderman. He comes through Red Willow in October." October, 6 weeks away. "I need to see the ranch's financial records," she said. "The last 3 years." Nathan went very still. "Why?" "Because when Alderman comes through Red Willow in October, I want him to sit at this table and eat a meal I've cooked and look at a set of numbers that shows what this ranch's household management costs looked like before I arrived and what they look like now." She paused. "And I want Gertrude Aldous at that table, and Mitchell Crawford. And I want it to be clear to Alderman before he leaves Red Willow that the decision-making happening at this ranch is the best it has been in years." Nathan stared at her. "You want to host a dinner for the bank's territorial representative," he said. "I want to have the truth on the table before Pratt's version gets there first," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze for a very long time. Then he went to the office off the main room and came back with the ranch's main financial ledger box and set it on the table in front of her. "The last 4 years are in there," he said. She pulled the box toward her and opened it. They worked through the afternoon together, Nathan explaining the cattle operation's financial structure and Clara cross-referencing it against her kitchen accounts, and the picture that emerged was exactly what she had suspected from the moment she walked into that ruined kitchen on her first day. The ranch was sound in its core business. Nathan Cole knew cattle. But the household had been bleeding money through inefficiency and neglect for years. The inflated supply costs, the waste, the lack of preservation, the dependence on town prices for things that could have been sourced locally, and the numbers Clara had been quietly improving for 5 weeks showed a trajectory that was frankly striking when laid against the previous years. "This is significant," Nathan said, looking at the comparison she'd laid out. "I know," she said. "Pratt is going to look like a fool." "Pratt is going to look like what he is," she said. "A man who decided to be an obstacle before he understood what he was trying to stop." Nathan looked at the numbers again, then at her. "When did you know that the numbers would show this?" "The first day," she said, "when I saw the kitchen." He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief. In something closer to wonder. "You walked in that first day and you already knew." "I walked in and I saw a problem I knew how to solve," she said. "That's all." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "I'd like you to be there," he said. "When Alderman comes, not in the kitchen, at the table." She looked at him. "I'll be cooking." "You can cook and still be at the table when it matters," he said. "I want Alderman to understand who is responsible for what the numbers show." She looked at him steadily. He was not making a gesture. He was making a decision that the woman he had brought here as a household manager was going to sit at the same table as the bank's representative and take her place as what she actually was. Not a decoration, not a convenience, a partner. "All right," she said. It was after dark when they finished, and Clara made supper a simple meal late, and quiet the two of them at the table with the lamp and the ledger pages spread around them. She put the food on the table and sat down, and they ate together for the first time. Not the first time she'd fed him. The first time she'd sat at the same table at the same meal. Nathan looked at his plate and then at her, and he said, "You haven't been eating with us." "I wasn't sure where I stood," she said simply. He met her eyes. "You stand here," he said. "At this table. That's where you stand." She looked back at him for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. They ate without talking much, but the silence was a different kind of silence than it had been in the early weeks. Not the silence of two strangers navigating careful distance. The silence of two people who had been working on the same thing all day and didn't need to narrate it. Then Nathan said quietly, almost to the lamp, "My mother used to sing in the kitchen." Clara stilled. "She wasn't a particularly good singer," he said. "But she always did it. Said she couldn't cook in silence. Said the food came out wrong if the room was too quiet." He paused. "She died when I was 19. The kitchen went quiet after that. Stayed quiet." Another pause. "I didn't know how much I missed the noise until you came." Clara stood at the wash basin with a plate in her hand, and she looked at Nathan Cole, and she felt something shift in her chest that was more than she was ready to name. "I don't sing," she said, "but I can talk while I cook." He looked up. What was in his face was not the careful reserve of the early weeks. It was something more open. Something that looked in the lamplight like a man standing at the edge of something he hasn't stood at in a long time. "I've noticed," he said. She went back to the washing, but she was smiling, facing away from him, and she let herself feel it. The cooperative agreement was finalized on Monday and signed by Crawford on Wednesday. By the following week, 2 more ranches east of the Double C had sent representatives to talk to Clara directly. Not Nathan, not Walter, but Clara about the terms. She sat at her kitchen table with ranchers' men and spoke plainly and answered their questions without ornamentation, and every person who left that table left with a signed participation agreement. Eli watched the 3rd representative leave on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Did you always know how to do that?" he asked. "Talk to people like that. Like you already know what they're going to say before they say it." "My mother used to say that the best way to win an argument is to have already had it in your own head 100 times before the other person shows up," Clara said. Eli thought about this. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said. "But it works." He laughed. The easy, unguarded laugh she'd come to count on as one of the better sounds on this ranch. What happened next was not something Clara had had in her own head beforehand. It came from a direction she hadn't been watching, and it hit with the particular force of things that catch you off guard because you were looking somewhere else. Pratt came to the ranch himself. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon without notice in a good coat that was trying too hard for a working ranch call, driving a hired buggy with the kind of deliberate presentation of a man who wants to establish from the outset that he has resources. He asked for Nathan at the door and got Clara instead, because Nathan was at the north fence and Clara was the person who answered the door of this house. She looked at him, and she knew immediately who he was, from the set of his shoulders and the way he looked at her, and found something he'd expected and something he hadn't. "Mrs. Cole," he said with a smile that didn't match his eyes. "I've been meaning to pay a call." "Mr. Pratt," she said. "Come in." She showed him to the kitchen table, because the kitchen was where she was strongest, and she offered coffee because offering was courtesy, and refusing courtesy was information you could use. He took the coffee. He sat across from her and looked around the kitchen with the assessing look of a man who had already decided what he was going to find and was slightly thrown by finding something different. "I'll come to the point," he said. "I'm a practical man." "Please do," she said. "You've been making trading arrangements with local producers that are cutting into the general store's business," he said. "Eggs produce preserved goods. These are products the store has traditionally supplied to ranches in this area. At significant markup," she said. He looked at her. "The markup funds the operation of a store that serves the whole community." "I'm not making a moral argument about your pricing," she said calmly. "I'm explaining why I made the arrangements I made. I have a household budget and an obligation to this ranch's finances, and trading directly with local producers at fair prices serves both. The cooperative you're putting together," he started, "is a voluntary arrangement between ranches that benefits all participants," she said. "It doesn't prohibit anyone from purchasing through your store." Pratt looked at her for a long moment, recalibrating. He had come expecting defensiveness. He had not come expecting clarity. "The bank representative alderman," he said, trying a different approach. "He'll be through in October." "I know," she said. "We're planning a dinner." Something flickered in his expression. "A dinner. Nathan would like Mr. Alderman to see the ranch's operation in full," she said. "We'll be having several of our cooperative partners. Mitchell Crawford, among others." She paused. "I believe Gertrude Aldous has also expressed interest in attending." Pratt was very still. She watched him understand what she was telling him, that by the time Alderman arrived in Red Willow, Clara Cole would have already built the kind of community standing that made Pratt's story about an outsider woman making dangerous decisions not just unconvincing, but actively embarrassing to the teller. "You've been busy," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "I'm always busy," she said. "That's not going to change." He picked up his hat. He stood. "You're not what I expected," he said. "People keep saying that," she said. He left without finishing his coffee. Clara sat at the table after the sound of the buggy faded, and she breathed out slowly, the way you breathe out after carrying something heavy for longer than you realized. Walter came in from the yard and looked at the untouched coffee cup and looked at her face. "Was that Pratt's buggy?" he said. "It was." "What did he want?" "To find out whether he still worried me," she said. Walter looked at her. "Did he?" "No," she said. He made a sound in his throat that was as close to a satisfied growl as a man of his particular dignity was capable of. He poured himself a coffee from the pot on the stove, sat down at the table in the chair Pratt had just vacated, and said, "Tell me what he said." So she told him. When she finished, Walter's jaw was set. "I should ride into town," he said. "You should do no such thing," she said. He looked at her. "Clara, Walter." She met his eyes. "The best thing you can do for this ranch right now is exactly what you've been doing. Keep the operation running. Keep the men steady. And in October, when Alderman sits at this table and sees what we've built here, be here to confirm what the numbers show. That's where you win. Not in town." He held her gaze for a long moment. That recalibration she'd seen before. That updating. "You've already got it figured out," he said. "I've got it started," she said. "Figured out comes later." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He stood up. At the door, he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "there isn't a man on this ranch who wouldn't go to the wall for you now. You know that." She let the words land. "I know," she said finally. "That means something to me." He left. She stayed. The smokehouse ran its first smoke on a Saturday in late September. Eli was there at 4 a.m. to build the fire, and Clara was there at 4:15 to confirm the fire was right and the green apple wood she'd sourced from an orchard 2 valleys over was positioned correctly. The first thing they put through was venison. 3 haunches Roy and Cade had brought back from a hunting run, prepared and salted down overnight, rubbed with the spice mixture Clara had worked out over 2 days of calculation. She showed Eli how to manage the fire for a long smoke, not hot steady, the particular banked quality that kept the temperature consistent over 12 hours. "You're going to be here all day," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't sound like that was a problem. She checked on him every 2 hours throughout the day. Between checks, she was in the kitchen managing preparation for the following week's first formal cooperative exchange. It held. The wagon started arriving Thursday morning. Crawford's man came with wool-preserved mutton and root vegetables. Hendricks came himself with squash and dried beans. Mrs. Danforth sent eggs and 2 kinds of preserved fruit that turned out to be extraordinary. The Cole Ranch's contribution was the smoked venison, Clara's preserves, and a substantial quantity of pickled vegetables. When she set it all out in the cold room alongside the other ranch's contributions, she stood and looked at it for a long moment. Walter came and stood beside her in the cold room doorway. "My God," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "You built this in 8 weeks." "We built this in 8 weeks," she said. "Roy found Hendricks. Eli managed the first smoke run. You kept the men working. Nathan rode to Crawford." "You thought of all of it," Walter said. "Thinking of it and building it are different things," she said. "I couldn't have built it alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "October's going to go fine." "October is going to go fine," she agreed. She believed it. The numbers were clear. The relationships were real. The cold room was full and the smokehouse was running and smelling like everything she had promised it would smell like. Gerald Pratt could say what he liked in Laramie. What Alderman would find when he arrived in Red Willow was a ranch operating at a level it hadn't seen in years, managed by a woman who had walked in with 1 travel bag and a promise to herself that she would not break. She had kept it. She closed the cold room door. She went back to her kitchen. She had a dinner to plan. The dinner was set for the 2nd Friday of October. Clara had been planning it for 3 weeks, and the planning itself was a different kind of work than anything else she did on the ranch. Not physical, not immediate, but the slow, careful architecture of an evening that had to accomplish several things at once and could not afford to fail at any of them. She needed Alderman to leave that table convinced. She needed Crawford and Aldous at that table to demonstrate the community standing she'd built. She needed the food to be extraordinary, because food was her language, and this was the most important thing she'd ever needed to say. And she needed all of it to look effortless, because the moment it looked like effort, it became something a man like Pratt could characterize as desperation. She had talked to Gertrude Aldous twice in the weeks leading up to it, once at the Ladies' Aid meeting, where she'd given nothing away about the dinner's specific purpose, and once privately, where she'd told Gertrude exactly what was at stake. Gertrude had listened without interrupting, which from Gertrude Aldous was its own form of approval. "You understand what you're asking," Gertrude said when Clara finished. "I'm asking you to attend a dinner and be yourself," Clara said. "I don't think that's complicated." Gertrude looked at her for a long moment. "What you're really asking is for my presence to signal to a bank representative that this ranch and the woman running it have standing in this community." "Yes," Clara said. "That's what I'm asking." "And do we," Gertrude said, "have standing?" "You tell me," Clara said. "You've been to the ranch. You've seen the kitchen. You've attended 2 Ladies' Aid meetings where I've been present. You've heard what Crawford says about the cooperative." She paused. "Do we have standing?" Gertrude held her gaze for a long moment. "Friday the 14th, she said. "My husband and I will be there at 6. Now it was Thursday evening the night before, and Clara was in the kitchen at 11 o'clock with every burner on the stove occupied, and the cold room organized to the inch and a list on the table in front of her that she'd been checking and rechecking for days. Nathan came downstairs and found her at the table. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the stove, at the cold room door, at the list, at her. Then he went to the stove and poured himself a coffee without asking and sat down across from her. "You haven't slept," he said. "I'll sleep Saturday," she said. "Clara." She looked up from the list. It's going to be fine, he said. I know it's going to be fine, she said. I'm making sure. He looked at her steadily. In the lamplight, his face was tired and something else, something that had been building in his expression for weeks and hadn't yet resolved into words. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said. Whatever Alderman says, whatever Pratt has managed to put in his ear before he got here, none of it changes what I know about this ranch and what you've done here. She looked at him. I know that, she said. I'm not sure you do, he said. I'm not sure you understand that even if tomorrow went badly, which it won't, I wouldn't be sending you back. There's no scenario in which I'm sending you back. The kitchen was very quiet. She had not known she needed to hear that until she heard it. She had told herself, and told herself honestly, that she had built something real here and that real things don't disappear because one man from a bank in Laramie has doubts about them. She had believed it. But believing something and having someone say it to you plainly are different. Thank you, she said. And her voice was steadier than she felt. He nodded. He looked at the list. What still needs to be done tonight? Nothing you can help with, she said. Go to bed, Nathan. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her face and decided against it. He stood. He picked up his coffee cup. At the door, he stopped. Clara? Yes, I'm glad you came, he said. Simply, directly, without the careful management of words that was usually his approach to anything personal. She held his gaze. So am I, she said. He went. She sat alone in the kitchen for a moment with her list and her stove, and the smell of the ham brine and the bread dough resting under its cloth, and she breathed in and breathed out, and she went back to work. The guests arrived at 6 on the dot. Crawford first alone, as was his habit. Then Gertrude Aldous and her husband. Then 2 of the other cooperative ranchers Clara had invited to fill the table, men who had become genuine partners in the past weeks, and whose presence would demonstrate, without being stated, the scale of what she'd built. Alderman came at 6:15. He was younger than Clara had expected, early 40s, with a neat dark suit, and the precise manners of a man who has spent years presenting himself as neutral when he is not. He shook Nathan's hand, was introduced to the other guests, and then looked at Clara. Mrs. Cole, he said. I've been curious to meet you. Why curious? She asked. He blinked slightly. He had not expected the question. I've heard interesting things about the changes at this ranch, he said carefully. From Gerald Pratt, she said. He blinked again, more visibly this time. Among others, he said. Good, she said. Then you've heard the concerned version. Tonight you'll see the actual version. Please come in. She turned and went back to the kitchen, and she heard behind her the small silence that meant several people in the entryway were exchanging looks. She didn't need to see the looks. She could work with the reaction. The meal she served that evening was the finest thing she had produced in her life. Not because she had used the most expensive ingredients. What she had used was everything she knew about feeding people, every technique her mother had taught her, and every adaptation she'd made for Wyoming ingredients, and she had put all of it on that table with a precision and care that amounted to something she had no better word for than intention. There was a soup first, a clear broth made from the smoked venison bones, deep and clean, carrying the particular flavor of applewood smoke that Crawford recognized immediately, because his eyes went to Clara when he tasted it in a way that said he knew exactly what he was tasting and where it had come from. Then the ham slow roasted all afternoon with a crust that cracked at the knife, and an interior that was something beyond anything the men at that table had likely eaten since their mother's kitchens. Fresh bread. Pickled vegetables from the cold room. Roasted root vegetables that Hendricks himself had sent over specifically for this dinner when Eli mentioned it in passing at the cooperative exchange. The pie came last. She had made 2 one-apple from the dried apples she'd found on her first day in this kitchen. 1 dried fruit and walnut from a recipe her mother had made for celebrations in Missouri. The table went quiet the way it always went quiet when she fed people who hadn't eaten her food before. Gertrude Aldous, who had been to the ranch before and was therefore not surprised, watched Alderman's face as he ate the soup and caught Clara's eye across the table and gave her a single precise nod that communicated in the compressed language of two women who understand each other that the situation was proceeding exactly as it should. Alderman ate everything. He ate 2 pieces of bread. He asked for a second piece of pie and then looked slightly embarrassed at having asked, and Clara put a second piece in front of him without comment, and he ate that too. Crawford, somewhere around the ham, said, "The smokehouse is up and running." "It is," Clara said. "What are you smoking this week?" "More venison. And Roy brought back a small elk 2 days ago that I'm planning for next week if the cold holds." Crawford nodded with the expression of a man receiving good news. "Margaret used to do elk," he said. "Never found a way to replicate it after she passed." "If it comes out the way I'm planning," Clara said, "you'll have an invitation to judge." Something moved across Crawford's face that she had not seen there before. Something warmer and more private than the professional respect of the cooperative negotiations. "I'll hold you to that, Mrs. Cole," he said. Alderman had been watching the exchange. He looked at Clara, and then at Crawford, and then at the room at Gertrude Aldous, at the 2 cooperative ranchers, talking with the easy familiarity of men who have become genuine partners at Nathan, at the head of the table, with the look of a man who cannot quite believe the room his house has become. "Mrs. Cole," Alderman said, "I wonder if we might discuss the ranch's financial position." "Of course," she said. "Shall I bring the ledger now, or would you prefer after dessert is finished?" He looked at his pie plate, slightly abashed. "After," he said. "Then please finish your pie," she said. "There's no discussion that can't wait for pie." Laughter around the table. Real laughter from people who were at ease. Nathan followed her into the kitchen while the others were finishing. He came through the kitchen door and looked at her, and what was on his face was something she'd never seen there before. Something that had come loose from all the careful management and was just itself. "Clara," he said, "do you know what's happening out there?" "I know what I planned for," she said. "Is it what I planned for?" "It's more than what you planned for," he said. "Alderman has barely looked at me all evening. He keeps looking at you." "Good," she said. "That's the point." He shook his head slowly. "It's not the food," he said. "I mean, the food is extraordinary, but it's not just that. It's the room you made out there, the cooperative partners Gertrude Crawford talking about his wife. That's not a dinner, that's a community. You built a community and you put it at the table, and Alderman is sitting in the middle of it and understanding that this ranch is not what Pratt told him it was." She looked at him. "That was the plan," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "Was any of it real? The Aldous friendship, Crawford, the others, or is it all strategy? Nathan?" Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Do you think Gertrude Aldous comes somewhere she doesn't want to be? Do you think Crawford talks about Margaret's elk recipe with people he doesn't trust?" She paused. "Everything at that table is real. I didn't manufacture it, I built it. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long time. "How? In 2 months. How did you do all of it?" "I paid attention," she said, "to what this place needed and who the people in it were. And then I did the work. That's all it ever is." She got the ledger. The financial conversation happened over coffee at the cleared table with Gertrude and the cooperative ranchers still present, because Clara had planned it that way. She walked Alderman through the 3-year comparison herself clearly and without apology. Crawford said at one point, "The cooperative arrangement she put together is the most practical thing I've seen in this territory in 20 years. Alderman looked at Crawford. "You said she put it together." "Every bit of it," Crawford said. "The proposal, the terms, the exchange system. Nathan wrote out to talk to me, but the thinking behind it was hers." Alderman looked at Clara. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the room. "I was told this ranch was at risk," he said. "You were told wrong," Clara said. "Evidently," he said. And then quietly, "Who told you about the bank concern?" "This is a small territory, Mr. Alderman," she said. "Information moves." He looked at the numbers one more time. "The cooperative agreement. It's a formal document. Signed by 6 ranches, she said. I can send you a copy. He looked up at her. For the first time all evening, his carefully neutral expression had slipped enough to show what was underneath it, a man updating a significant assumption. Please do, he said. The guests left at 9. Crawford was last, and he paused on the porch and turned to Clara and said without any professional distance, Margaret would have liked you. She felt that land somewhere real. Thank you, she said. He tipped his hat and walked to his horse. She watched him go, and when she turned around, Nathan was standing in the doorway. He said nothing. He just looked at her. They went inside. The men had already cleaned the table. Eli and Roy had appeared and done it without being asked, and the kitchen was quiet and smelling like everything she'd cooked and the candles she'd used for the table. She sat down. Nathan sat across from her. Pratt is finished, he said. Probably, she said. Alderman is not a man who likes being used for someone else's purposes. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Clara, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to need you to let me say it without interrupting, because I'm not good at this, and I'll lose the thread if I stop. She folded her hands on the table and waited. When I wrote the letter, he said, when I put the advertisement in the paper, I told myself I was being practical. I needed someone to run the household. I told myself that was all I needed. He paused. I was lying to myself. I was lonely, Clara. I'd been lonely for years, and ordering a wife felt like the only solution I had that didn't require me to admit that. He looked at her steadily. And then you came. And the ranch started working again, and the kitchen started being a kitchen again. And people started wanting to be here, instead of looking for reasons to leave, and He stopped. Then, I think I've been falling in love with you since the second week. I kept talking myself out of it because the arrangement was supposed to be practical, and I didn't know if that was something you would want, or something you could believe given how this started. The kitchen was absolutely still. Nathan, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know because you've given this ranch everything, and I've been giving you account authority and supply budgets, and I've never just said it plainly. You deserve plain. She looked at him for a long time. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, she said. That's the truth of it. I was 30 years old, and I'd spent my whole life being too much of one thing and not enough of another. I didn't come here expecting to find this. I didn't come here expecting you. He was very still. I've been paying attention to this ranch, she said. And I've been paying attention to you. And I don't say things I don't mean, Nathan. So hear me when I say this. I am not here because I have nowhere else to go anymore. I am here because this is where I want to be. He looked at her carefully. That's not the same thing as what I said, he said. I know, she said. I'm working up to it. Don't rush me. Something moved across his face, the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him in 2 months. The beginning of a real smile. Take your time, he said. I think I love you too, she said. I've been thinking myself out of it for the same reasons you have. And I think we've both been spending energy on that thinking that would be better spent elsewhere. Elsewhere like what? He said. Elsewhere like the ranch, she said. And the cooperative, and the smokehouse. And whatever it is that 2 people do when they stop treating a real thing like a practical arrangement. He held her gaze. I don't know what that looks like, he said honestly. I haven't been good at it. Neither have I, she said. But I've never yet found a problem I couldn't figure out if I paid enough attention. He laughed. A real laugh, the first fully open one she'd heard from him without any of the careful management. It made him look younger. It made the kitchen feel warmer than the stove could account for. She went to the stove to check the damper for the night, and behind her she heard him stand. Clara, he said. She turned around. He was close enough that she could see the lamplight in his eyes, and what was in them was nothing she'd seen in his face before, none of the assessment or the careful management. Just something direct and clear and entirely itself. Thank you, he said, for coming, for staying, for all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you for the kitchen," she said. He looked confused. "The kitchen? You gave me a kitchen," she said. "Even if you didn't know you were doing it. It was broken and cold and 6 months neglected, but it was a kitchen." She paused. "You don't know what that meant to me." He looked at her, and she thought he understood more of it than she'd said. "I think I'm beginning to," he said. The morning after the dinner, the ranch woke to the first hard frost of the season. Clara was at the stove before anyone else, and she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the white-touched yard and the smokehouse standing solid in the early light, and she felt the winter coming the way a woman feels. A thing she has prepared for, not with dread, but with something close to satisfaction. They were ready. Eli came in first and stopped when he saw her expression. "Good morning?" he asked carefully. "Very good morning," she said. "Sit down. I'll make eggs." He sat. She made eggs and biscuits and put coffee in front of him, and he looked at her with the honest curiosity she'd valued in him from the first day. "How did it go?" he asked. "With the bank man." "Well," she said. "How well?" Crawford endorsed the cooperative directly. Alderman asked for a copy of the cooperative agreement. The numbers were clear. She paused. "I think it went the way it needed to go." He let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since she started talking. "Good," he said. And then, he didn't deserve to get what he was after. "No," she agreed. "He didn't." Walter came in last. He looked at her the way he always looked at her now, with the full weight of his attention. "Alderman was here 7:30 this morning," he said. She turned around. "He came back. Rode out from town specifically. He asked for you." She had not known Alderman was there. She had gone to the porch for firewood and found a man in a neat dark suit sitting on the step and not immediately understood what she was seeing. Alderman had looked at her and said without preamble that he had a proposal. That the bank held paper on 2 other ranches in the territory with struggling household operations. That if she was willing to consult on both, the bank would consider a reduced rate on the coal ranch's existing notes. Nathan had come out before Alderman finished. He stood at the doorway and heard the last of it. "What did you tell him?" Nathan asked now from the kitchen doorway. "I told him I would talk to my husband," she said. The kitchen went very still. Nathan looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" "I think about the woman who might be running one of those kitchens right now," she said quietly, "and not knowing what to do with it." He nodded. "Then tell Alderman yes." She sent Eli with the note. The answer came back within the hour. It was Roy who put words to what the table had absorbed. "So you're going to be teaching other ranches what you did here." "Advising," she said. "Teaching," he said, because Roy called things what they were. She looked at him. "I suppose so," she said. "Good," he said. "Somebody should." Cade Morrison said from his end of the bench, without looking up. "Long as it doesn't take you away from this kitchen, too many days at a time." Laughter around the table. Clara looked at all of them. These 8 men who had watched her step off a wagon 2 months ago and had not known what they were seeing, and she felt something she had been careful not to let herself feel too fully until she was sure of it. She was home. Walter said before he stood. "One more thing. Billy Walsh went to town yesterday before the dinner." He paused. He told Pratt directly, not heated, not confrontational, just clear. He told Pratt that the coal ranch had the finest kitchen in the territory and the finest woman running it, and that if Pratt had a problem with either of those facts, that was his problem and not this ranch's. Billy Walsh at the far end of the bench was extremely interested in his coffee cup. "Billy," Clara said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. His ears went red. "Wasn't anything," he mumbled. "It was something," she said. "It was exactly the right thing." He looked back at his coffee, but the red had become something else. Pride, the particular feeling of a young man who has done something that the person whose opinion matters most has confirmed as right. She went back to the stove. The frost was burning off the yard now. the October sun doing its work, and through the kitchen window she could see the smokehouse and the garden and the yard of the Cole Ranch and all the work she had done in 2 months and all the work still ahead. She thought about the woman who had pressed her hands flat against the side of a wagon in this same yard and refused to cry. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known. She had known the work. She had known the kitchen. She had known that if she kept going and kept doing what she knew how to do, the work would speak for itself eventually. She hadn't known what eventually would look like. She turned back to her stove because there was still lunch to make and the smokehouse fire to check and a letter to write to one of the ranches aldermen had mentioned, and the work was always there. The work was always the answer, and she had never once been afraid of it. The letter from the first ranch came back within 10 days. It was from a woman named Vera Hutchins, who ran the household of the Rocking H spread 40 miles east of Red Willow, and who had been given Clara's name by aldermen with the particular brevity of a bank representative who has decided something and doesn't feel the need to over-explain it. The letter was short and cautious. The letter of a woman who has been told that help is coming and doesn't entirely believe it yet. Clara read it twice, then a third time, paying attention to what was underneath the words rather than the words themselves. She had learned to do that from her mother, who used to say that what a person leaves out of a letter tells you more than what they put in. What Vera Hutchins had left out was everything. She hadn't said how bad the kitchen situation was. She hadn't said how long it had been that way. She hadn't said what the men were eating or whether the ranch's winter supply was anything like adequate. She had said in careful, neutral language that she would appreciate any guidance Mrs. Cole might be able to offer at her earliest convenience. Clara set the letter on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up a pen. She wrote back the same day, not a cautious letter, but a direct one. She asked specific questions. She asked about the stove's condition and the state of the cold room, and whether there was a garden. She asked about the supply chain and the winter stores, and the number of men being fed. She asked what Vera Hutchins needed most urgently, and she asked it plainly, the way she asked everything. She sent Eli to town with it the next morning. Nathan watched her write the letter from across the kitchen table, where he'd been going over the fall cattle accounts, and when she sealed it, he said, "You're going out there." "Eventually," she said. "I want to know what I'm going into first." He looked at her. "You could just go and assess." "I could," she said. "But if she's anything like I was when I arrived here, she's already embarrassed. She doesn't need me showing up and looking at what she hasn't been able to fix. She needs to tell me herself in her own words, so that when I get there it's a conversation and not an inspection." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You weren't embarrassed when you arrived here," he said. "You were the least embarrassed person I'd ever seen walk into a disaster." "I was terrified," she said. "I was just better at not showing it than most people." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I know that now." She held his gaze. There was something between them that had changed since the night of the dinner, not dramatically, not all at once. In the real way, the way things change when two people have said something true to each other and then had to go on living their daily lives in the same space, and the daily life has slowly become something different because of what was said without either of them needing to announce it. He had started sitting with her at breakfast. Actually sitting with her at the same time eating the same meal. It was a small thing. She valued it more than she had words for. She went back to the letter. Vera Hutchins wrote back in 4 days, and this time the caution was gone, stripped away by Clara's direct questions, which had left no room for careful neutrality. The second letter was 3 pages long, and it was, Clara understood as she read it, an act of significant courage from a woman who had been managing alone and badly for a long time, and had just been given for the first time someone to tell the truth to. The stove had a cracked firebox. The cold room had flooded in August, and nobody had properly dried it out. The garden had never been planted because Vera had arrived in June too late for spring planting, and didn't know yet what grew well in that territory. The winter supply was almost nothing. The men were surviving on salt pork and hardtack, and were making noises about leaving. Clara set the letter down. "Nathan," she said. He looked up from across the room. "I need to go to the Rocking H," she said. "This week." He read what was on her face. He didn't ask for details. "I'll arrange it," he said. She was on the road to the Rocking H by Thursday. Eli drove the wagon. She had packed it herself, not charity, but working tools. Extra preserving jars, a supply of dried herbs, 3 of the best smoked venison pieces from the smokehouse, 2 of her own canning lids and rings, and the account ledger, because she wanted to show Vera Hutchins the same thing she'd shown Nathan, that the numbers, when you understood them properly, were the clearest map to what needed to be done. Vera Hutchins met them in the yard. She was younger than Clara had expected, 26, maybe 27, with the look of a woman who has been trying very hard for a long time without enough support and is beginning to show it around the edges. She looked at the wagon and then at Clara and then at the wagon again. "Mrs. Cole," she said. "Clara," she said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting to be helped. "Show me the kitchen." Vera showed her the kitchen. It was worse than Clara had expected, and she had expected it to be bad. The cracked firebox wasn't just cracked. It was cracked in a way that meant the stove was losing heat on one side and overcooking on the other, so that anything Vera had tried to cook had been fighting the equipment the entire time. The cold room smelled of the August flood, that particular damp that gets into wood and doesn't leave without serious intervention. The shelves were sparse in the way that told Clara the supply situation was genuine and not exaggerated. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. "How long?" she asked. Vera knew what she was asking. "Since we arrived," she said. "June. I didn't know where to start." "Nobody told you," Clara said, not a question. "No," Vera said quietly. "Nobody told me." Clara turned to look at her directly. "Do you know what I walked into when I arrived at the Cole Ranch?" Vera shook her head. "The stove was propped up with firewood," Clara said. "The shelves had rusted tins from years back. The cast iron had gone so far beyond neglect, I had to scrub it for 2 hours before it was usable. The garden had been abandoned for 6 months. And the first thing one of the ranch hands said when I stepped off the wagon was something I am not going to repeat." Vera stared at her. "I'm telling you this," Clara said, "because I want you to understand that what you're looking at in this kitchen is not a failure. It's a starting point. I've seen this starting point before. I know what to do with it." Vera's face did something complicated relief and something rawer than relief. The expression of a woman who has been blaming herself for a situation that was never entirely her fault, and has just been told by someone with no reason to lie about it, that the blame is not where she put it. "I thought it was just me," Vera said, "that I was doing something wrong." "It's the firebox," Clara said. "Sit down. I'm going to show you something." She pulled out the account ledger. She stayed at the Rocking H for 2 days. In those 2 days, she showed Vera Hutchins the same things she'd built at the Cole Ranch, compressed and adapted for the specific situation, how to work the stove's uneven heat to your advantage instead of fighting it, how to build a workable cold room system even in a flood-damaged space, how to assess what the land around the ranch could provide. She helped Vera make a supply list with the same logic she'd used on her own first day. She showed her the cooperative agreement and explained how it worked, and told her she would talk to Nathan about whether the Rocking H qualified for early inclusion. On the second evening after the supper they'd cooked together in the difficult kitchen, Vera sat across from her and said something quietly. "My husband thinks I'm not suited for this," she said. "He hasn't said it directly, but I can tell." Clara looked at her. "Has he seen what you've been working with?" "He sees the results," Vera said. "He doesn't think about what's underneath them." "Then show him," Clara said. "Not with an argument. Show him with what you build when the tools are right." She paused. "There is nothing wrong with you, Vera. There is a cracked firebox and a flooded cold room and a supply situation that would have challenged an experienced woman with 20 years of frontier cooking behind her. That's what's wrong, not you." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "Does it get easier?" she said. Clara thought about that honestly. The work stays hard, she said, but the hard changes shape. In the beginning, everything is an obstacle. Then the obstacles become familiar, and familiar things are manageable even when they're difficult. She paused. And then one day, you look up, and the kitchen that was a disaster is yours, and the people you're feeding are yours, and the place is yours, and it stopped being hard in the way it was hard at the beginning. How long did that take you? Vera asked. Longer than 2 months, Clara said, and also, in some ways, exactly 2 months. When she climbed back into the wagon on the morning of the 3rd day, Vera stood in the yard with something on her face that had not been there when Clara arrived. Not hope exactly, but something more solid than hope. The look of a woman who has been given tools she understands how to use and knows that the rest is work and that she can do the work. Thank you, Vera said. Send me a letter when you have a question, Clara said. And you will have questions. That's not a problem. That's what letters are for. Eli clicked the horses forward, and the wagon rolled out of the yard. What it felt like was something more continuous than satisfaction, the sense of a thing that had started in her and would keep going. She had given Vera 2 days and a wagon full of tools and an honest conversation. Vera would build on that, or she wouldn't, and either way, the decision would be hers. Clara hadn't built what she'd built at the Cole Ranch because someone held her hand through it. She'd built it because the kitchen was there, and she was the person who understood kitchens, and she had gotten up every morning and done the work. All she'd given Vera was the same thing her mother had given her, the knowledge that the starting point wasn't the ending point. The rest was always up to the person standing in the kitchen. Nathan was waiting in the yard when the wagon came in. He was not doing anything that required him to be there. She could see that, but he was there, and he looked at her when she climbed down with the look of a man who has been waiting longer than the length of the absence and doesn't want to make a point of it. How was it? He said. Worse than I expected, she said. Cracked firebox, flooded cold room, no winter supply. And Mrs. Hutchins? She's going to be fine, Clara said. She just needed to know it wasn't her fault. He looked at her steadily. Did you tell her about when you arrived here? She looked at him. How did you know I did? Because it's what you would do, he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went inside. Nathan followed. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. The stove banked low, the cold room full, the shelves organized to her system, the smell of sage and coffee and clean iron, and the lingering warmth of apple wood smoke. Home. Fully and completely and without qualification. Nathan poured her coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm because he had known she was coming back, and had kept it on, and that small domestic truth landed in her chest, in the place that had been waiting for it. They talked through the rocking H situation. She explained what she'd seen and what Vera needed and why the cooperative inclusion made sense. He listened without rushing. He said yes. She sent the letter to Vera that evening. That night late, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. The smokehouse. The cold room door properly latched. The bunkhouse where 8 men slept soundly after eating well the way they had slept every night for 2 months. Nathan came to stand beside her. I want to tell you something, she said. He waited. When I stepped off that wagon, she said, I made myself a promise that I would not let this place break me, that whatever it took, I would build something real here or spend every last piece of myself trying. She paused. I kept that promise. You did, he said. But what I built is more than I promised myself, she said. I promised myself survival. I built a home. She turned and looked at him. That's because of you. Not the kitchen, not the cooperative, not the smokehouse. You. Because you gave me room to be exactly who I am without asking me to be something easier. Nathan looked at her for a long time. You didn't need my permission for any of it, he said. No, she said. But I needed your respect, and you gave it to me before you had any reason to. He was quiet. What was on his face was everything she had learned to read in 2 months of watching him carry things in silence, the full weight of it, the realness of it, The expression of a man who has stopped managing his feelings and is just feeling them. "Clara," he said. "I would like to stop treating this like a practical arrangement now," he said. She looked at him. "Good," she said. "So would I." He took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He just reached across the space between them and took her hand the way you take something you have decided is yours, and she let him the way you let go of the distance when you no longer have use for it. They stood together at the window of their kitchen in the October dark, and outside the smokehouse stood and the cold room held, and the cooperative ran its quiet, useful work across 6 ranches. And the Wyoming winter was coming the way Wyoming winters always came, hard and certain and long. They were ready for it. The woman who had pressed her hands flat against a wagon and refused to cry had not just survived this place. She had become it, its warmth and its work, and its daily bread, and its stubborn, patient, bone-deep refusal to be anything less than what it was capable of being. And that was not a small thing. That was the whole thing. That was everything.